I am 65 years old, and I have learned that silence is not empty, it has a weight, and I have carried that weight inside me for 14 long years. It has lived in my chest like a cold stone, heavy and unmovable. My name is Ella Hartwell, and I have lived through the kind of betrayal that breaks most women, but I did not break. I endured. I waited. The morning that changed everything was quiet and gray, a Tuesday in October when the mailman came. Walking up the path, whistling a tune I barely noticed him until he held out a single envelope. The handwriting on it froze the air in my lungs. Nathaniel, my sons, writing the careless, slanted letters that used to appear on birthday cards and school permission slips. Now they carried something else, something sharp. I felt my hands tremble, not from fear, but from that terrible instinct mothers never lose hope, that maybe this time it will be different. Lindsay, my daughter, was visiting. She was standing behind me, holding her coffee mug. Her voice cut through my thoughts. Mom, is that from him? I nodded, unable to find my voice. She moved closer. Don't open it, she said, her tone sharp, protective. Whatever he wants, it isn't worth the pain. I looked down at the envelope. There was a faint brown smear on one corner, like dried blood or ink. My stomach turned. A strange chill crawled up my spine. Still, I took the letter and sighed. Lindsay followed me to the kitchen. We sat at the table, the same one where Nathaniel had done his homework, eaten his cereal, laughed, and once screamed that I was a worthless woman before walking out of my life. I opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside smelled faintly of cheap cologne. I began to read. Mother, I suppose you think you've won by refusing to contact me all these years. Your silence was always your weapon, wasn't it? The cold shoulder, the disappointed looks, the way you made me feel like I was never good enough. Well, I've made something of myself despite you. I'm writing because I need financial assistance to expand my business. I know Dad left you well off, and it's time you contributed to your son's success. Instead of hoarding it for yourself, I expect $50,000 wired to the account below within 2 weeks. Don't pretend you can't afford it. I know what you have, and don't think you can ignore this. I'm your son, and you owe me for the childhood you ruined with your impossible standards and cold heart. Nathaniel, I sat still for a long time. The words burned themselves into me like acid. Lindsay leaned over, reading it too. Her sharp breath was full of disgust. Mom, he's delusional. He's demanding money after everything. But I barely heard her. Something inside me was shifting. The trembling had stopped. I felt a calm colder than anger. It was the feeling of something ancient waking up. I looked at Lindsay, my good daughter, the one who had stayed, the one who had helped me survive my husband's death, my son's abandonment. She looked at me with worry on her face. You're not going to give him anything, are you? No, I said softly. No, I won't give him money, but I will give him something else entirely. That night, after Lindsay left promising to call in the morning, I sat alone in my study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust. The shelves were filled with photographs of my family before everything went wrong. Robert, my husband, smiling in his uniform. Nathaniel, as a boy, missing his front teeth. Lindsay in her yellow dress. There was a time when those pictures were my comfort. Now they felt like ghosts staring at me. I picked up the letter again, reading each word slowly, the way one might handle a venomous snake. The account number, the deadline, the tone of entitlement, all of it told me something. Nathaniel was desperate. He needed money fast, and he believed he could still manipulate me the way he always had, but he had forgotten that silence changes people. I remembered the day he left. He had been standing in this very kitchen, rage twisting his young face. You're a worthless woman, he had said, clinging to Dad's memory like it means anything. He's dead, and everything he worked for should be mine. You ruin everything you touch. You made me this way. I had begged him not to go. I had dropped to my knees and begged him, please, Nathaniel, I'm your mother. Don't do this. He had looked down at me with contempt and said, don't contact me. I don't have a mother anymore. Then he walked out of the door and out of my life for 14 years. The years that followed were quiet but not peaceful. I filled them with small routines, tending my garden, baking for the church, sorting through Robert's things. But every night when the house was still, the silence pressed against me like a living thing. I told myself I was healing, but really I was waiting for this day. I had promised myself back then on that kitchen floor that if Nathaniel ever came back, I would never beg again. I would not cry. I would not plead. I would not break. I would respond with precision, with patience, with the kind of calculation that only comes from pain forged into steel. Now the time had come. I took out my fine cream-colored stationery, the kind Robert had once bought me for special letters. It had a faint scent of lavender and wealth. I wrote, Dear Nathaniel, and paused. The words to follow needed care. I could have written anger, I could have written love, but what I wrote instead was a performance, a mother's mask. I thanked him for his letter, told him I was proud of his ambition, but that I needed a few days to arrange things. I told him to come visit me in person that it would be good to see him again. After so long, I signed it lovingly Mother, then sealed it with my ring, pressing the pearl into the wax. That was the first move of the game I had waited 14 years to play. As I sat there, the night deepened outside and rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window. I stared at my reflection in the glass, an old woman with silver hair and steady eyes looking back at me. I realized something important. I no longer felt grief. I felt purpose. There was no sadness in me, only clarity. Nathaniel thought I was still the woman who once wept at his cruelty, but he had forgotten the most dangerous truth about silence. It doesn't mean surrender, it means preparation. When I finally went to bed, I could not sleep. Memories crept in like unwelcome guests. Nathaniel as a boy running through the garden chasing butterflies. Nathaniel at 12 lying with perfect ease about a broken vase, blaming his sister Lindsay, crying in the corner. My husband saying, "Give the boy time, Ella, he'll grow out of it." But he never did. He grew into it. Manipulation had become his nature. I remembered once when he was 17. He told Lindsay that their father would be disappointed in her for wanting to spend her allowance on a doll she had saved for months. He convinced her to give him the money instead for what he called a family investment. He bought candy and comic books and lied without blinking. That was Nathaniel, charm and deceit in the same breath. The next morning I woke with the same calm resolve. I prepared breakfast out of habit. Though I wasn't hungry, the air in the house felt different, heavier. Maybe it was the knowledge that the past was finally stirring again. I mailed my letter to Nathaniel that afternoon. The sky was a dull silver, the air cool and dry. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as the postman took it away. He had no idea that he was delivering the first piece of a reckoning. Days passed. Lindsay called every evening, checking on me. She didn't trust Nathaniel, not after what he had done. She had always been the practical one. I reassured her I wasn't sending him any money. She didn't need to worry. What I didn't tell her was that I was preparing something else. I went through old financial records, through the remnants of Robert's estate. I studied the trust accounts Nathaniel had once tried to steal from. I found names, bank connections, contacts I had not thought about in years. I discovered one of Robert's old business partners, still alive, a man named George, who had once warned me about Nathaniel years ago. He had said, "Ella, your boy is smart, but he's got a dangerous kind of smart, the kind that believes rules are for other people." That evening I called George, and after a long moment, he answered, his voice cracked with surprise. "Ella Hartwell, my God, it's been years." I told him I needed information about my son. There was a pause, then a sigh. He told me things that made my blood run cold. Nathaniel wasn't just desperate, he was drowning. He had started a company that was more illusion than reality, built on borrowed money and fake promises. He had taken investments from people under false pretenses, and now they were starting to ask questions, serious ones. He was in trouble, and not just financial. When I ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. The weight in my chest, that old stone, felt lighter somehow, because now I understood. Nathaniel hadn't written to reconnect, he had written to save himself, and he thought I would be his salvation. He was wrong. I walked to the fireplace and looked at the portrait of Robert that still hung above the mantel. He had been gone for 20 years, but his eyes seemed to hold the same steady wisdom they always had. I whispered softly, "Don't worry, Robert. I'll take care of it this time." That night, as the clock struck midnight, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the same table where the story had begun 14 years ago. And as the wind outside howled through the trees, I smiled, not a cruel smile, but the kind that comes from knowing that justice sometimes wears the face of patience. I was no longer the woman begging her son not to leave. I was the woman preparing to teach him what silence truly costs. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by shadows and memories, I felt something break free inside me, not my heart, not my will, but the weight itself. The stone that had lived in my chest for so long began to crumble, and in its place something new was born, calm, steady, unstoppable. I told Daniel I needed a trust that looked real, a trust with clauses and conditions, and a veneer of old money legitimacy, something that would sound irresistible to a man like Nathaniel, who still believed paperwork could cure his failures. He laughed softly, then he grew serious and said, "Leave it to me. I will draft language that sounds impenetrable, and I will place it in a bank name he recognized. He will ask for proof, and we will make him jump through hoops, and he will not like it later." That was all I wanted. Patience and procedure. The next 2 weeks were a dance of letters, calls, and careful deception. Daniel created documents that smelled of authority. He sent a friendly letter from a lawyer at a reputable bank, explaining that a discretionary legacy fund had been established in Nathaniel's name as a provisional inheritance that could be accessed only after certain conditions were met. The conditions were technical and humiliating. They required documentation of business licenses, tax filings, evidence of revenue, and endorsements from current investors, all perfectly plausible and perfectly designed to be just out of reach for a man who had been building his empire on smoke and mirrors. Daniel even arranged for a tasteful brochure complete with a bank emblem and the kind of legalese that convinces people to believe what they want to believe. I sealed those papers in an envelope and sent them to Nathaniel with a short note expressing my joy at finally being able to help him after years of misunderstanding. The note read, "I am pleased to tell you that I have arranged for assistance to support your business growth. Please review the attached and provide the requested documentation at your earliest convenience. With love, Mother." Simple and maternal and utterly irresistible. To someone starved for approval. 2 days later the reply came, not in a letter, but in a phone call, his voice full of triumph. I phoned quietly from my kitchen and asked him about the documents. He was evasive at first, then excited, then pleading. He promised everything he could not possibly produce. He said he had investors lined up that would gladly vouch for him. He said Madison was on board. He said the bank had already expressed preliminary interest, but they needed paperwork to move forward. He asked if I could expedite the process. I played the part of the concerned mother and told him I would help him however I could. I hinted at connections without promising specifics. I could hear the hunger in his voice, the way airless people sound when offered bread. I listened, and I recorded every note like a botanist cataloging a poisonous plant, each promise a petal, each contradiction a thorn. I had no intention of giving him a cent, not a coin. Instead, I fed the trust, the same thing his life had been fed for years: lies and expectation and measured humiliation. I made him wait for the forms. I asked for more information. I sent polite reminders. And then I called Daniel and asked him to raise new questions. To complicate the process, a missing signature, a notarization from another county, a requirement for an appraisal of business assets, all the little bureaucratic hurdles that prick the ego and make a man who depends on quick wins start to fumble. Nathaniel reacted exactly as I had predicted. He became frantic, pleading, indecisive, angry, then resentful. He began to accuse me of manipulation. Once again, he wrote that I was playing games, trying to ruin him. He threatened to come down and see me in person. I told him with a calmness that surprised even me that he was welcome to visit and that I would be glad to discuss everything in person if he could show proof of his investors and his tax filings. That was all I wanted. Show me your life and numbers, and I will believe you. I had no doubt he could not do it. He could never do it. And he reminded me of a younger version of himself when he had conned classmates out of pocket money or convinced teachers he deserved special treatment. He had always been better at performance than production. While Nathaniel stumbled with paperwork, I quietly widened my net. I called a woman named Claire, whom Nathaniel had dated briefly years ago. Claire had never been trustworthy with him, but she had been honest with me after the affair. When she came to the funeral of Robert and cried in a way that looked like relief, not only grief, Claire remembered small things that mattered. She remembered a check Nathaniel had once written to a man who sold fake certificates. She remembered a business name that came up in conversations and then disappeared. Claire agreed to meet me for tea. She arrived with careful hesitation, and when she sat across from me, she looked older, lighter, and terribly weary. She told me about a ledger she had found once in Nathaniel's things, pages of names and transactions that did not add up, people who paid and then were never repaid, small sums that added up to something much larger. She told me about threats she had heard from men who would not be ignored and about late-night phone calls full of apologies, excuses, promises. She gave me a copy of an old receipt with a faded logo and a partial tax form with numbers that did not match anything real. These things were threads, and I was beginning to see a tapestry of deceit. I whispered, "Thank you," and Claire left with a look of relief, as if she were giving a weight away. I kept her documents close. I archived them in a folder labeled Nathaniel Evidence, and I slept better for it. Nathaniel's anxiety increased as my manufactured bureaucracy tightened around him, but I did not stop there. I began to contact people he had wronged, investors, scammed clients, women he had charmed and discarded in his wake. At first these people were suspicious. They did not want to relive the pain until I told them I was Nathaniel's mother, which opened doors. Some slammed shut, some opened slowly, but the ones that mattered opened wide. I found a man named Frank who had invested his life savings in One of Nathaniel's schemes, a scheme that had promised high returns and delivered empty contracts. Frank's voice on the phone was raw and honest. He told me he had gone to the authorities, but the case had been dismissed because the paper trail was deliberately messy. I gave Frank the patience to explain, and I gave him what he had wanted most: someone who would believe him when he told the truth. I asked him to gather his papers to come to my house to sit at my kitchen table and tell me everything. Frank came with a shoebox of receipts, photos, emails, and he sobbed, not from the sort of theatrical remorse Nathaniel had once faked, but the small, hopeless sobs of a man who had been betrayed by both hope and his own judgment. I listened and took notes. I asked questions about dates, about bank names, about contract signatures. We put the papers in order, and suddenly the evidence that had once appeared as random, shameful incidents became a pattern, intentional and ugly. Meanwhile, Nathaniel called more often. He accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. He wrote furious letters claiming I had hired people to harass his clients. He said he would sue me for slander. He sent messages in the morning, at noon, and in the black hours of night. Sometimes his messages were childish, sometimes vicious, but always full of panic. I never answered. In anger, I wrote calm notes. I reminded him of the conditions for the trust and how generous I was in even offering his help. Quietly, I sent another letter that contained a small photograph, a photograph of him as a teenager at a baseball game. The image was innocuous, but it was mine. It meant I was watching and remembering, and I wanted him to feel that small prickle of being seen and judged. It unnerved him more than any threat I could make, because Nathaniel thrived on invisibility and on the idea that he could disappear and reappear while leaving other people's lives in ruin. My letters implied a surveillance, not a pursuit. I wanted him to know his past would not dissolve in a cloud of his own arrogance. The net I had woven began to show strain on Nathaniel's life. The bank that had agreed to review the trust documentation sent back a polite but firm refusal, indicating concerns about the legitimacy of his statements. They requested additional proof that tied his business activities to verifiable revenue streams, which he could not provide. I forwarded the response to him with a note expressing my disappointment. He wrote back, angrily insisting the bank was corrupt or biased. He lashed out publicly on social media, claiming his mother was trying to ruin him, which only made the people I had contacted more willing to talk. They felt vindicated to see that Nathaniel's persona was fragile, and they began to share more details. One by one, they revealed the same picture of a man who had convinced people with charm but could not produce the substance to back his promises. It was around this time that Madison appeared at my door. She had heard from one of Nathaniel's acquaintances that his mother was contacting people. I opened the door, and there she stood, young, pretty, and exhausted. The light caught her eyes and made them look hollow. I invited her, and she sat at my kitchen table and folded her hands. She told me at first that she loved Nathaniel, that he was a good man who had been unfairly maligned. Then she cried and told me that his lies had started small and grown monstrous, that he borrowed money to buy gifts, wore suits he could not afford, and promised weddings he had no means to fund. She told me he had taken a loan in her name and then vanished from the repayment schedule. She said she had confronted him and been met with fury and a desperate apology. She told me she feared him sometimes when he became irrational and unpredictable. I held her hands and listened, and when she left, she hugged me with the kind of gratitude that feels like a small confession. Sometimes being believed is the kindness people need most. All of this was moving along exactly as I had planned, but life holds variables, and one night a variable barged through my door in person. Nathaniel arrived without warning, his figure filling my doorway. He looked tired, angry, small. I rose from my chair and faced him. He stood there for a moment, studying me, perhaps calculating whether the woman before him was the same one he had once cursed. He stepped inside, and the air between us crackled. With old familiar pain, he sat down and spoke first. He said, "You have no right to meddle in my life. You have no right to ruin me." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt the old motherly instinct to reach out to this young broken man, but it was gone, replaced by a new clarity. I said quietly, "I have a right to protect myself and others. You have caused harm that cannot be ignored." He flinched as if struck. I told him calmly about the trust and about the documents I had requested. I watched his face as the realization dawned that I had not simply refused him, I had made him prove himself. And he had nothing to prove. I did not shout, I did not cry. Instead, I described the people who had come forward, how they had trusted him and been betrayed, how their savings had been spent and their dreams sold to an imaginary future. Nathaniel's face crumpled into something hard to recognize. At first, he tried to deny and blame others. Then he grew vicious and said I was a monster, I was petty, I was trying to destroy him for nothing. I listened, and then I said something I had rehearsed not cruelly, but with the clarity I had cultivated over 14 years. You left, you stole, you lied, you made choices, you built your life from other people's losses. And now you want me to fix what you broke. I will not do it for you, but I will make sure you cannot do it to others again. His anger turned to pleading. The old performance returned for a moment, and he begged. I begged my father, and he cried, and said he would change, it would be different, if only I would help him. I watched the pattern unfold, the manipulative apologies, the promises that had never meant anything. When his voice began to gain that old practiced sincerity, I felt something like pity, but it was disciplined pity, not the kind that dissolves convictions. So I gave him an option. I would help him, but only by waking him up to the truth of his own actions, by requiring him to face facts and to account for them in public. If he wanted access to the trust, he had to make restitution to those he had harmed, to provide public evidence that his business was legitimate, and to accept mediation with his claimants. He scoffed at the word restitution, as if pride could pay a debt. I told him if he refused, I would proceed with the men and women he had wronged to pursue legal action, and I would speak to the bank too. Ensure their scrutiny was thorough. I did not say I had already spoken to lawyers, or that Daniel had prepared letters, or that Frank and the others had been advised on how to proceed. I let him wonder, and that was part of the sentence I had prepared for him. Uncertainty is a sharp instrument for an insecure man. He left that night, and I watched the taillights fade and felt something heavy lift from my chest, not because revenge made me joyful, but because the stone that had pressed there had been transformed into a tool. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel attempted to scramble. He tried to make amends in the sort of reckless, sloppy way that only those used to getting things without effort can attempt. He offered partial payments to a man named Frank, who accepted them because any return felt like vindication. He created a shaky list of investors, some real, some fabricated, and sent it to the bank that had evaluated the trust, but the bank's due diligence found gaps and inconsistencies, and now regulatory investigators had become interested in the pattern of missing funds. The social media posts he created to claim success were met with calls from angry clients and former employees demanding answers, all of which I watched with a calmness that belonged to someone who had waited long enough to know the shape of things. I continued to encourage and coordinate quietly. I met with Frank, Claire Madison, and others. I offered what help I could not, financial but practical counsel, and a place to speak. I told them the truth about Nathaniel's pattern and encouraged them to bring cases together to form a cohesive complaint together. They were stronger than alone, and their pain had become purpose. It is strange to admit that in the process of orchestrating consequence, I found a kind of release, not revenge in the petty sense, but a righting of balance. I did what a mother should have done long ago, not by blindly protecting a child at the expense of others, but by holding him accountable in a way that might force him to see himself truly. I never wanted to watch my son destroyed, only to watch him become honest and repair what he had broken, and if that required humiliation, if it required that he sit and look at the ledger of his life, then so be it. The slow machinery of accountability is not quick, but it is merciless once set in motion. And as Nathaniel's empire of illusions began to unwind, he blamed me publicly. He wrote a letter accusing me of betrayal, claiming I had used my influence to ruin his reputation. He begged the press for sympathy, and he begged friends for money that never came. His life shrank from a performer's stage into the cramped rooms where debt collectors wait. He showed up at my house once more, but this time his posture was different. He did not stand tall and arrogant. He stood small and ashamed. He asked again for help, and I offered him something else. I offered him an audience with the people he had hurt. I told him he could answer their questions and make restitution. If he was sincere, I could help arrange it. If he refused, I would hand over the files to the authorities, and the bank and the men and women he had defrauded would take the next steps. He looked at me as if he might finally understand, and then something in him broke. That was not repentance. It was surrender, a cold, exhausted surrender that comes when a life built on illusion finally meets the weight of consequence. When he left that final night, I felt neither triumph nor victory, but a quiet closure, like the closing of a heavy door. I had not wanted to be the instrument of another's ruin, but I had not wanted to be silent any longer either. The silence I had borne for 14 years had transformed into something that could hold both sorrow and justice, and in the end that was enough for me to sleep through the night without dreams of bargaining with a ghost. The morning light slipped quietly through the curtains, touching the edges of the mahogany desk where Ella sat motionless. The trust papers lay before her, sealed, stamped, and immaculate, their legal language folded neatly around her intentions. She traced the embossed lettering with a fingertip, feeling the faint ridges beneath her skin. For a long time she simply breathed, steady and calm. Then she placed the envelope inside a larger one and wrote her son's address in careful, even script. It was done. A single letter could build or destroy a lifetime, she thought as she walked to the post office. The street outside was crisp and full of sound. Cars humming, leaves brushing across the pavement, the echo of someone laughing far away. It all felt oddly alive to her, as though the world had been asleep and had just now remembered to wake. Inside the post office, she handed the envelope to the clerk with a polite smile. The clerk weighed it, stamped it, and slid it into the outgoing tray. The moment it left her hand, Ella felt something deep inside uncoil, a quiet release she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For 14 years, she had been frozen between love and anger. Now she was moving again. 3 days later, Nathaniel received the letter. He sat in his kitchen surrounded by empty coffee cups and unpaid bills, his laptop open to a spreadsheet that refused to make sense. Madison had left early for work without saying goodbye. The air in the house felt heavy, as if it carried all the arguments they hadn't finished. When he saw the envelope with his mother's elegant handwriting, his chest tightened. He opened it quickly, scanning the first lines. The words, Family Renewal Trust and Beneficiary Conditions, jumped out at him like light through fog. His hands trembled. It looked official. So official that for a moment he forgot to breathe. A trust fund. His mother was offering him money after all. Maybe the old woman had finally realized who held the power now. He read every paragraph, lips moving silently. The trust required proof of business stability, bank statements, tax records, and character references from 3 long-term clients. It also required a waiting period of 90 days for evaluation by a neutral trustee before any funds could be released. At the bottom was a single sentence written in his mother's unmistakable hand. Integrity is proven by patience. He laughed out loud, a short bitter sound that filled the room. Integrity is proven by patience, he repeated mockingly. You want to play games, Mother? Fine. I'll play. That afternoon he called Madison. She answered on the second ring, distracted and tired. What now, Nate? I'm at work. You're not going to believe this, he said, pacing across the kitchen. My mother set up a trust. It's huge, Maddie. She's finally doing the right thing. Madison sighed. What's the catch? No catch. Just paperwork, formalities. Once I send the documents, it's done. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't that simple. He hadn't filed taxes properly in years. His client list was paper thin. His so-called investors were nothing more than names scribbled on a napkin. Still, he couldn't let Madison see that. Maybe this is good, she said slowly. Maybe you can fix things between you two. Fix things. His voice sharpened. She owes me, Maddie. After everything she's put me through, she owes me this. Madison didn't argue. She rarely did anymore. When she hung up, he felt a sudden emptiness, the kind that echoed. Days turned into weeks. Nathaniel forged documents, altered spreadsheets, and composed letters of reference signed with imaginary names. He worked late into the night, convincing himself that the end justified the means. Each time he looked at the trust papers, he imagined the life that would follow, the car, the bigger house, the smug satisfaction of proving his mother wrong. Meanwhile, Ella moved quietly through her days, tending her garden, meeting friends for tea, answering Lindsay's calls with calm assurance. She didn't mention the trust. She didn't need to. Every morning, she checked the small post office box she'd rented under a different name, where copies of Nathaniel's submissions arrived for review. She read each one carefully, her eyes tracing the lies with an almost clinical detachment. He hadn't changed. Not a bit. Still, she continued the charade. Daniel helped her craft polite, professional replies, letters from the trustee's office requesting clarification, additional documentation, proof of client history. Each one was perfectly worded to sound bureaucratic yet fair. And with every exchange, Nathaniel's tone grew more frantic. One evening, after the third request for verification, he slammed his laptop shut and shouted at Madison. They're stalling me on purpose. They're trying to humiliate me. Madison flinched. Maybe they just need more time, Nate. More time? I've given them everything. He waved a handful of papers in the air. I'm drowning here and they're sitting on my money. Madison's eyes filled with quiet sadness. Your mother didn't owe you anything, she said softly. He froze. What did you just say? She didn't owe you, Madison repeated. You cut her off, remember? You took her money and vanished. Maybe she's just protecting herself. The slap came before he even realized he'd raised his hand. The sound was sharp, echoing through the small house. Madison stumbled back, one hand to her cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief. Nathaniel's breath came hard and fast. You don't talk to me like that, he hissed. You have no idea what she's done. Madison said nothing. She turned and walked to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was colder than any winter. That night, Nathaniel drank until the walls blurred. In the early hours he sat on the porch, staring at the dark horizon, his thoughts spinning. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that he'd gone too far. But pride was louder. At dawn, Ella woke from a dream she couldn't fully remember. Something about a child standing on a bridge, calling out her name. The air outside was misty, the garden silver with dew. She stood by the window for a long time, watching the sun climb slowly over the trees. For the first time in years, she felt almost peaceful. Then the phone rang. It was Daniel. Ella, he said, his voice measured. I think it's time to move to the next step. He's sending desperate messages to the trustee address, threatening legal action. If we keep pushing, he might break. Ella closed her eyes. Then let him, she whispered. Sometimes breaking is the only way people learn what they're made of. The next letter she sent required proof of client contracts and a notarized financial statement. Nathaniel's reply came in 2 days, furious and unhinged. He accused the trustee of fraud, his mother of manipulation, the world of conspiracy. He ended with a single line that made Ella pause. I don't even know why I bother. Maybe none of this matters anymore. She sat very still, reading that sentence over and over. For the first time since she'd begun, a flicker of doubt crossed her heart. Was she pushing him toward redemption or ruin? That night, she dreamed again of the child on the bridge, calling her name. Only this time, when she reached out, the child turned away. The following morning, she drove to the town once more. She parked a block away from his house and watched. The lawn was overgrown, the truck unmoved. Through the window, she could see Nathaniel sitting alone at the kitchen table, head in his hands. Beside him, an empty bottle glinted in the sunlight. She stayed only a minute before driving away, her hands tight on the wheel. The plan had been clean, elegant, controlled, but now she could feel the edges fraying. When she got home, Lindsay was waiting on the porch. Mom, she said, eyes full of concern, you look pale. What's going on? Ella forced a smile. Just tired, darling. Too much gardening. Lindsay wasn't convinced. I've been thinking about Nate, she said hesitantly. Maybe you should talk to him. Not about money, just talk. Ella's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. Some wounds don't heal with words. Maybe not, Lindsay said gently, but silence can make them worse. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the clock too loud. She thought about the trust, the letters, the look on her son's face years ago when he'd taken her jewelry and blamed the nurse. She remembered how small he'd been once, running through the garden, laughing, calling her name. That boy was gone, but perhaps a shadow of him remained. She rose before dawn, brewed tea, and sat at her desk. The next letter she wrote was not part of the plan. It was short, only a few lines. When you look in the mirror, Nathaniel, do you recognize the man you've become? There was a time you wanted to make your father proud. He believed you still could. So did I. She didn't sign it. She simply sealed it, stamped it, and mailed it. 3 days later, Nathaniel received it. He stared at the familiar handwriting for a long time before opening it. When he finished reading, he crumpled the paper in his fist, but then slowly smoothed it out again. For the first time in months, he didn't feel angry. He felt tired, bone-deep tired. He walked to the mirror above the sink and studied his reflection. The man who looked back was hollow-eyed, unshaven, and frightened. He whispered, "What happened to you?" But the mirror gave no answer. He didn't know that miles away, Ella sat by her window whispering the same question to the night. The internet never forgets. That was something Nathaniel taught me once, back when he still visited for holidays and tried to impress me with his knowledge of technology. I had smiled politely, pretending not to care, but I had remembered. And now, years later, it was his own words and history that became my greatest allies. The posts from his high school years spread quickly through alumni pages, small-town gossip networks, and message boards filled with people who had once adored him. At first, I thought it might fizzle out, but I underestimated how much people love seeing someone fall, especially someone who had spent years pretending to be better than them. Within days, Nathaniel's name became a quiet whisper in the corners of the internet. His old photos resurfaced with mocking captions. A video of him giving a motivational speech at a local seminar was edited into a cruel parody. Even the few remaining friends he had began deleting their comments, trying to distance themselves from the chaos that now surrounded him. I watched it unfold like an artist admiring her work. Every step deliberate, every reaction predictable. Daniel called me one morning, his tone a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Ella," he said slowly, "I've handled estate disputes for 30 years, but I've never seen anything like what you've done. You've destroyed him without ever touching him." I stirred my tea, the spoon clinking softly against porcelain. "Destroyed?" I asked mildly. "No, Daniel. I've just revealed him. People destroy themselves when truth comes out." He was silent for a long moment before saying, almost to himself, "You're not doing this for vengeance anymore, are you?" "No," I whispered. "This isn't vengeance. It's balance." That word lingered with me all day. Balance. It was the only thing that felt right. Robert had always believed in justice, in fairness, in consequence. Nathaniel had twisted that belief, turned it into a weapon against everyone who loved him. But I could still restore what was lost. I could make sure the scales were even before I was gone. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from Lindsay often. She was busy with her children and her work, and I encouraged that. She didn't need to see the part of me that was now fully awake, the part that had spent years waiting, thinking, planning. She still thought of Nathaniel as her brother, and I let her keep that illusion for now. Meanwhile, my private investigator continued her quiet work. She found new details about Nathaniel's life, where he spent his nights, who he borrowed from, who he lied to next. He was living in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that rented by the week and didn't ask questions. He tried reaching out to old friends, but none had answered. Some had even blocked him. His phone was disconnected twice that month. He pawned his watch, then his laptop, then a piece of jewelry that used to belong to Robert. That one hurt. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the photo of Robert wearing that ring, the one I had given him for their 20th anniversary. The private investigator had sent me a picture of the pawn ticket, Nathaniel's messy signature scrawled across the bottom. There was no anger left in me, just an ache. A deep, hollow ache that whispered how far my son had fallen and how necessary this all was. That night, I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay there, eyes open, listening to the old house creak and breathe. For years, this house had been too quiet, too heavy with unspoken words. Now it felt alive again, as though it too understood that justice, once denied, was finally being served. The next phase came to me like a whisper in the dark. Nathaniel had always been good at pretending, playing the victim, charming people with his tragic stories. So I would give him one last stage, one last audience. Through Daniel's contacts, I arranged for an anonymous post to appear on a popular business forum, something about a whistleblower exposing fraudulent practices in small investment circles. The post included enough detail from the documents Nathaniel had submitted to the fake trust to make it sound legitimate. Within hours, users began speculating, connecting dots, identifying names. By the end of the week, Nathaniel's name was trending in local business circles again, but not in the way he wanted. Employers he'd once courted for partnerships publicly distanced themselves. A few even released statements about never having worked with him. His LinkedIn page, what little remained of his professional image, was flooded with comments. Some mocking, some furious, all damning. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. I had been waiting to use the letter. The one he'd written to me 14 years ago, the letter that started all of this. I still remembered every word. Every cruel, deliberate word that told me I was worthless, controlling, suffocating. The words that said I had driven him away. Now they would speak again. With Daniel's help, I had a journalist friend quietly publish an article titled, "When Family and Fortune Collide, the Hidden Face of a Failed Heir." The story was written as a broader commentary on greed and inheritance, but between the lines, anyone could see it was about Nathaniel. It mentioned the letter, quoted portions of it, and ended with a haunting line that I had written myself. Some wounds are self-inflicted, and some inheritances are never meant to be claimed. He was wrong. I finished the thought silently, and the last piece of paper in my hand fluttered as the wind came in through the open window and touched the edge of the desk the way memory touches a wound, and then moves on. I had no desire for spectacle and no appetite for confession. I had no need to explain myself to anyone any more. The years had taught me that explanations are for those who seek absolution. I sought only balance, and I had found it had taken years' patience planning, silence, and a careful cruelty that never lost sight of the facts of his life, not the fantasies Nathaniel had fed himself, and others he had spent his life believing charm could replace work, that charisma could outweigh honesty, that boldness could cancel consequence. He thought he was untouchable because he had convinced himself he had already outrun the truth. He had not, and he never would have if I had not made sure he learned the slow arithmetic of consequence. I folded the final letter into the hearth of the fireplace and watched the paper curl and blacken as fire took what was left of his entitlement and turned it into ash. Watching the flames consume the last token of his demands felt like closing a ledger, playing the final balance across a scale. I had kept careful records of everything, not to gloat, but because truth must be measurable if it is to be proven. After the fire burned low, I walked to the window and looked at the garden where roses, the color of late summer, trembled in the breeze. My pearls lay cool against my collarbone, and for a moment I thought of Robert, and of the quiet, ordinary life we had imagined for our children. The life had been ordinary once, and then it had fragmented around us. Now order had been restored in its own merciless way. I slept that night without dreams in a way I had not known was possible since the day he left. I woke early the next morning to the sound of birds and the soft clink of china from the kitchen where Lindsay had left the kettle heating for tea. She called that afternoon, and we spoke about trivial things, about the neighbor's cat and the hole in our roof that needed mending. She asked about the roses, and I told her they were doing well. She did not ask me to explain the court proceedings or the letters, the blog, or the anonymous emails. She did not need to know. How could she understand the satisfaction that comes from saving others without becoming cruel? She had never asked me to be anything but her mother, and father had taught us both to stand firm in our morals, but not always in our methods. I thought of Margaret Shin and of Madison and of the quiet people who had written me letters in the months after the trial to say thank you, to say they could sleep again, to say they felt safe, to say they had reclaimed their lives. Those notes arrived tucked in stamped envelopes with careful handwriting and shaky signatures. Each one was a small apology to themselves for being human enough to trust and stupid enough to be betrayed. The law had done what it could, the courts had done what they could, but community and consequence had done what neither might have accomplished alone. Justice, which is rarely clean or simple, had been a collaborative work of truth being noticed and acted upon. I kept those letters in a box labeled favors and mercy, though mercy had not been what I delivered. Mercy had been what others gave each other in the aftermath of truth being known. People came to testify at the trials in odd ways. Some of them had never considered themselves activists. They were ordinary people who had been shown how to speak and had found their voices. When Madison sent her letter a year later telling me she had remarried and had a store that thrived, I folded it and put it in the same box. It felt right to keep the evidence of life restored beside the documentation of ruin. Nathaniel's presence, the jagged fracture he had caused, no longer took up space in my head like a live ember ready to burn. Rather, it had become a cold fact, like a scar, and scars are part of biography, not a current. That did not mean I was without sorrow. I had been a mother long before I had been an avenger, and some nights I still felt the echo of a child who once wanted nothing more than a peanut butter sandwich and a laugh from his father. Those memories came unbidden sometimes, and I allowed them a gentle room in my heart, but I never allowed them to soften the architecture of truth I had built around. Year 5 after his sentence, I received a letter from the prison chaplain. It was short and measured. He said Nathaniel had been attending some of the available programs and that he had asked if he might write to me. I set the envelope on my desk and left it there for 3 days like a small stone someone left on the path to see if a dog would sniff it. I am no child, I told myself. I am not interested in reconciliation for its own sake, and yet there was a human curiosity in me. I opened the envelope with a slow, deliberate patience. The handwriting was ragged and unfamiliar, a sign of hastily learned penmanship. "Orners, I'm thinking about you," it read in the awkward line breaks of an unpracticed hand. I thought at first to burn the letter, but I read on paper, "These are my only safe words. I have been given time to think about what I did and the weight of what it cost people. I am not good at being sorry on paper. I can try. My father used to say apologies come easiest in prayer, but I have no prayers left that mean anything to me. I am not asking for forgiveness, only to be seen as I am a man who did terrible things, and who will spend time to reflect and repair." The honesty of it astonished me. It was not the slick, manipulative apology that I had trained myself to expect in moments where people try to wiggle free. It was blunt, ungracious, and small, the kind of apology a man who had started to understand his life might produce. I put the letter in my lap and sat very still for a long time. The house above me was warm curtains moving with the air, and I realized then that something had shifted. Separately from my calculations, it was not mercy for him that came to me, though perhaps there was a small prickle of that. It was the recognition that consequences sometimes worked in ways I hadn't fully planned. The man in the prison cell was not only exposed to the law, he was exposed to himself, and sometimes being exposed is the beginning of a brittle sort of transformation. Later that year I visited the prison, not to argue for parole, but to understand what his daily life might be like. The guard at the desk scanned my ID with the habitual impassivity of those who handle human burdens as if they were weathered objects. I sat in the visitor's room with a plastic cup of bad coffee, and across from me sat a man who had been my son, and who looked ready to be someone else. I would not be swayed by theatrics. I sat and listened to the small talk that was less about me and more about what he needed to prove to stay alive. There was no great confession, no thunderbolts, no movie moment of redemption, just a thin human being learning to count the days and the small tasks that make a life manageable. I listened more than I spoke, and when I did speak, it was to tell him facts about the family, about his sister, about the garden, because the world of the garden is a neutral place where one tends and one prunes, and one learns patience. He blinked at me like a child and then like a man trying to remember how to be honest. When I left, I did not feel triumphant or cruel. I felt steady and small and a stranger to myself in a way that was not unpleasant. The news over the next years trickled with small legal details, his appeals failing the slow bureaucratic pace of prison life, and yet sometimes a compliance memo or a letter would arrive showing he had attended classes or worked in the library or mopped floors diligently. That didn't make him good, it made him human. It made him a person who could, in the most distant and unlikely way, be reformed or at least contained. If the world taught me anything in those years, it was that justice isn't usually a cliff, and then an end. It is a series of steps people take toward truth, and some walk them faster than others. For those he had hurt, there was a different kind of motion. The women who had lost money found employment through programs we helped fund anonymously. The elderly who had been conned learned to distrust flattering voices. A community recovered its caution and its compassion in equal measure. I used some of the money we had set aside not for revenge, but to create a small foundation for financial literacy. None of it carried my name. It carried a neutral title and a mission I supported quietly. I had no taste for recognition anymore. My purpose had been to stop Nathaniel and to restore perhaps even a little of what had been stolen. He had been a predator, and predators need fences, and like the programs were my fences, and the blog had been the light. I looked at the garden and thought of all the small things we did to keep it alive, pruning dead branches, enriching the soil, learning the slow calendar of weather and patience. Revenge had been a pruning of a different sort, necessary for the life beyond it to grow. The years pressed on and age with them. I turned 70, and my bones came with small protests, but the mind remained clear. The pearls I wore sometimes felt like armor and sometimes like memory, but they always signified something about who I was that could not be taken. The world had not forgiven me entirely for what I had done. Some neighbors whispered about the old woman who had engineered a fall. Some readers of the local papers had written letters calling me cruel. In the comments under articles, I had read them, and where one such words might have stung, now they brushed off like dust. He had been cruel first, they said, but that was no defense for cruelty. They were not wrong. I had done cruel things. No one who treads the path of balance can avoid cruelty. At times the difference was intention and outcome. I had no desire to be cruel without purpose. The point had always been protection and restoration. The law had sentenced him to 15 years, and in that sentence there was mathematics and medicine. The community breathed a little easier, and people returned to their lives. That did not mean scars disappeared. They simply became part of a history that people used as caution and guide. I spent my days tending the garden, reading old letters and walking slowly with Lindsay, and sometimes discussing the economic programs we supported. Sometimes neighbors would ask advice about their children, about how to set boundaries. I told them in simple sentences to keep records, to listen to the small voices of intuition, to refuse to be gaslit, and to let go when a relationship is corrosive. I taught them how to recognize manipulative patterns, not with complicated language, but with the bluntness of things that do harm. I found in that work a humble sort of redemption, not for myself, but for others. I could not change my son into the man Robert might have imagined, but perhaps I could stop the next person from being harmed by him, or someone like him. The old world of my house settled into a new rhythm. People came to my garden to sit sometimes, and I would give them tea in the small courtesies of an older woman who had lived too much to waste words. We never spoke of the specifics unless someone asked, and then I answered with a narrow honesty, leaving out what was unhelpful and focusing on what might guide them to safety. Once on a late afternoon, a young woman came to the gate. She had the sunburned look of someone who worked with her hands, and the look in her eyes of someone who had been cheated. She asked me how I had found the strength to act, and I thought about the years of radio silence, the stone in my chest that had once weighed me down, and how it had become an instrument. I told her exactly this: you keep a record, you trust small facts, you seek counsel, you wait, and you act with precision. She nodded and wrote it down in a small notebook. I never heard if she used the advice, but that didn't matter. Small acts matter, and sometimes the permission to act is the only gift a frightened person needs. In the evenings, Lindsay and I would sit on the porch and watch the sky grow dark. We rarely talked about Nathaniel, but when we did, it was not with anger, more like a study of a strange plant that had grown in our lives and been removed. We were often silent, and sometimes we wept without words. One night she touched my hand and said, "Mom, sometimes I think of him as a cautionary tale, but mostly I think of how careful I will be with my children, and I thought of your courage and your terrible choices, and I felt so proud and afraid." She was not angry with me. She was protecting her own life, and that was the best possible result of everything I'd done. The grandchildren played in the yard, oblivious to the adult histories that had shaped the boundaries around them, and I was grateful for their sounds, for the ordinary that rose like a hymn in the house I had created. In my 70th year, I sometimes dreamed of Robert and of the life that might have been, and then I would wake and tend the roses and think of the way petals fall and return to the earth, and that was a kind of lesson about cycles and endings. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a man named Frank, the one who had lost everything, and then came to me with a shoebox of receipts. The simple letter read, "Thank you for listening." It said, "I have started a small business. I am cautious now, but hopeful, and I wanted you to know you helped me find my voice." He included a photograph of a storefront with a small hand-painted sign, and I set that photograph beside the others as if each were a bead in a long line of improbable recovery. Margaret and Madison continued to visit. Sometimes we had tea and talked about small things, sometimes about literature, and occasionally about how the law works. Margaret would laugh and say to me, "You are an unlikely heroine," and I would retort, "I am hardly a heroine, but I am someone who refused to be a victim anymore." It felt like a reasonable answer. People asked me once if I would do it again if the situation repeated itself. I had thought on that question often. I would be firm and perhaps colder if necessary. I would always choose to protect the vulnerable and to intervene when someone has become a pattern of harm. It is not a question of cruelty, it is one of responsibility. I kept a small box under the desk with the final documents, the sentencing papers, a copy of the judge's statement, the letters from victims, the notes Daniel had kept, and occasionally I would open it and run my fingers across the paper. The texture of evidence felt almost sacred in a small way. It was a record, a ledger of acts and consequences, and it reminded me that stories have weight and that choices have geometry. Some nights children from the neighborhood would run past the house laughing, and the sound would carry up to my window, and I would think of the smallness of the world and the largeness of consequence. The balance had been restored, and that was a fact, not a verdict. Once in a while I would walk up the lane to the old church and sit in the back pew and not pray, but simply to be in a place where people had come to ask for mercy, and been offered songs later. When I left, I always felt lighter, as if the act of sitting in a consecrated space had moved something between my shoulders and allowed breath to pass. The years went on, and sometimes people asked me if I feared what would happen when Nathaniel was released. Perhaps he would come for me, perhaps he would try to unmake what I had done. I answered them with a small smile. I was 75 when the parole board first considered his case. I sat far from the deliberations. I read the transcript in the paper like a careful observer, and I felt no fear. I had outlived my rage and learned the long lesson of patience. He may be released one day, he may not, but I had learned how to live without that knowledge. The real danger he had posed had been contained, and that was enough for me. The last time I saw him in the visitor's room, he looked smaller and older than the last time he had left my house. He said his apologies in a way that was not cinematic but tangible, and I heard the careful accounting in his words. I did not forgive him aloud, I did not absolve him, but I listened, and when I left the room, I felt a closure that was not triumph, but a quiet folding of a long and painful map into a drawer. I returned home to the garden, and sat where the roses were in full bloom, and I thought about all the strange ways a life can be measured by the choices a person makes. I had chosen to act, and so I had to accept the moral cost of that action. It had been heavy at times, and yet the weight had taught me how to move with purpose. I had lost a son, and I'd saved a community. I had been both monstrous and necessary, and the paradox lived inside me like a truth I could carry openly. I was old now, and the measure of my days had narrowed to small pleasures. Tea in the afternoon, a call from Lindsay, a letter from someone who had found employment, a rose in bloom. My story might be ugly to some and beautiful to others, but it was mine. I had kept my promise to Robert to be steady and clever in the defense of those who could not defend themselves. I sealed the last file that evening and put it back in the drawer, and the house hummed in the simple way houses do when they are full of the quiet work of living. I walked outside and breathed the night air deep and steady, and smiled, not because I was untroubled, but because I had done what I had to do, and because for the first time since Nathaniel left my house I could rest without bargaining with my memory. The roses nodded their exhausted heads in the wind, and the pearls at my throat caught the moonlight and shimmered like a small, private promise kept.